We'll do that. We have a short conversation here because I know you're busy, but we're going to talk about a really important subject in the very first Faith Pavilion at a Word of Forum. But before we actually get to that topic, I just want to have you share about Habitat for Humanity and what you do. 70 years old, or 70 countries you work in. That's correct. 50 states in North America. But that doesn't mean everybody knows what you do and what you're about. So why don't you just tell us about Habitat for Humanity?
Thank you. So Habitat for Humanity is almost 50 years old now. It's hard to believe. Most people, when they hear about it, especially if they're from North America, they think Jimmy Carter. And the myth is that he both started and runs Habitat. Not true. But what is true is when President and Mrs. Carter got involved 40 years ago, that's when the world found out about Habitat. And that started a 35-year journey for them of building somewhere in the world every year. And that really brought attention to the mission. But Habitat's mission is to put God's love into action by bringing people together to build homes, communities, and hope. And it's become because of kind of like-minded people around the world. Just a few statistics. We've now helped over 59 million people have new or improved, mostly improved. The great majority of our work is in the global south, and we moved a while back from primarily building whole houses to, we wanted to reach very low income families, so primarily incrementally improving houses, still hoping to get them to the level of everything that would meet our standards for a home, but on terms they can afford. And so we work very broadly. I would say the next big evolution was moving from a framing question of how many houses can we build to a framing question of what would it take to meaningfully address the housing need in all the geographies we serve. And that's a more audacious question, which really forced us into thinking about systems and structures. So very engaged in policy and advocacy, especially around land rights for women and marginalized groups and around upgrading informal settlements right now. We're involved, we helped create a new asset class in housing microfinance, trying to get home improvement loans to be available to very low income families. And then now we're working towards building materials and skilled labor. And then ultimately the last test of how do we train families so they can actually manage their own construction. Because in the global south, about 70% of all the home construction is household led, not built by developers. And so really trying to, as we would use the language of demonstrate Christ's love by being a partner and catalyst for worldwide access to safe, decent, affordable housing.
That gives us an understanding of the scope that you do. And then the foundation of that, you've mentioned it is Christian. There's a misnomer that this could potentially be the first time that faith have turned up to a Word of Forum. That is not true. It's true in the sense that it's the first pavilion that has the word faith on it. So I've coined this term, faith behind, that animates organizations that don't lead with faith, i.e. Habitat for Humanity, and then organizations that I'm a part of, which is the Wood Evangelical Alliance. We lead with faith, and we work in housing and other places like that. So it's just a distinction between faith behind. So has faith been operative in you and Habitat before now? Absolutely, because you were here working.
Right.
And also, other organizations that faith behind, like World Vision. They may not know that out in the world that you're animated by faith. Does that distinction, faith behind, faith forward, make any sense to you in terms of, and is it helpful to make that distinction at this point in time where we have a big challenge to solve in cities and in housing and other places to make our cities thriving for all? Does anything resonate with you? You want to comment on that?
It really does. I often talk about us as faith motivated, that's the foundation of why we do our work. It is, but I think it's true. And what I would observe is parts of the development community are quite secular, and certainly parts of the system. But when you dig a little deeper, there are a huge number of people in all those organizations who are motivated by faith. So even if the organizations aren't, it's there. And I would say, for Habitat for Humanity specifically, we're not a religious organization. So we're not a church, and there are therefore legal requirements that come with that. But the way we talk about it is we are unapologetically Christian and radically inclusive. And I think what I fight is the idea that you have to pick one of those. And we would actually argue we're inclusive because of our faith, not instead of our faith. And in fact, following Jesus' example compels us to joyfully welcome and reach out and serve people of all backgrounds and faiths. And that in some ways, the very tangible nature of our work, we tend to be a faith in action organization because of the nature of what we do. We're about building communities and building homes. But if you say the beginning of our mission is God's love in action, that's why we do our work. The middle of our mission is bringing people together. And I've actually always loved that when people serve together, they focus on what they have in common and their shared values. I think when we sit at home on screens, we focus on how people are different or other, and often we focus on what pulls us apart or separates us. And sadly, the algorithms, and both for political or media purposes, they are paid and rewarded for driving wedges rather than bringing people together. But I actually find that service can be the antidote to a lot of that division and separation, because virtually all the faiths of the world have a deep value around service. And I think and we need both. I think that, certainly as a believer, I think we need the gospel in word and deed. But I think for Habitat and service organizations that are not, our job is to show up with that serving towel over our arm and not hide who we are in any way. Great example, we're here in Egypt, and Habitat, I was told, I don't have data, was the first international NGO to get registered as a Christian organization when we registered here. And it took much longer to do that. But one of the reasons we wanted to do that was so we could be really transparent, that we didn't want to come in and look like there was a hidden agenda, rather than say, no, this is who we are. And we will serve in a way that is non-discriminatory, and we will serve everyone. But we don't want to hide who we are.
That's one of the things that we're framed up here at the Faith Pavilion and in Faith for Cities, that we see multi-faith in this way, rooted in your tradition. So be fully Christian, be fully Muslim, be fully Hindu, rooted in your tradition. That's where your strength lies. That's where your values are. That's where you're supported in the work that you do. So rooted in your tradition and then linked. So then we can collaborate together, rooted and linked. Common cause for the common good. But that's the way that we understand multi-faith. So that's the way you're working as well.
It is, and we do a lot of interfaith work and multi-faith work, and which I rejoice in. And Egypt's a great example where we are. Population's about 90% Muslim, 10% Coptic Christian, and our work has always brought both together. And I remember the first time I came to Egypt many years ago. We were down in Upper Egypt. We were just talking about you go south to go up in Egypt because of the Nile. But we were in a village in Minia, and the way we were building in that community, or in the communities around there, was families had homes, but they were inadequate. And so the families would have to move out of their home for about 90 days while the community built a proper home they could then move back into. And I remember I was talking to the local imam of a mostly, but not exclusively Muslim community. And a Coptic family had been so helpful to their neighbors in their process of building that when it was their turn to move out of their home, the imam invited the family to live in his home for the 90 days. And we just don't hear these stories of connection. And what I've observed is one way of doing interfaith work is to say we all have to agree theologically before we can work together. I've never seen that work well. It's actually offensive in some ways to many faiths. The other model, which is much more what you've described, is no one has to give up who they are, but we come together out of our shared values to do something meaningful in the community. And I've seen really transformational things happen there.
Because we share a city. We share a place. We share a neighborhood. Right? That's what we commonly value. That's what we commonly want. That's what we commonly need to thrive. So we're going to do that together, Muslim, Christian, Hindu, and make the transportation system better, the park system better, the housing better for everybody. We're not leaving anybody behind. And I love that. And I had a conversation today, and the gentleman said, I get this, what you're saying now. It's like Intel, the computer, we understand the computer, but it had a little sticker on the side that said Intel inside, right? Faith is the chip inside that motivates people to do good, motivate people to work together, motivates that type of stuff. So this is why the Faith Pavilion is important, and this conversation is important, and understanding what you do. So I'm going to ask you a question in terms of, just go maybe a little deeper in terms of challenges that you may have had, and you mentioned something that was good, but you've learned over time. You're an old organization. You may have stumbled along the way. You may have learned some things in this space. What could you tell a secular partner that's out there generically? This is what you need to understand to work with a faith organization like yourselves. And then we're going to flip it around. We're going to say, what do you need to tell a religious organization to work with an organization like you in Habitat, so that ultimately we can work together better? What would you say?
Yeah, it's so good. And to me, I think the answer would be very similar in both directions, which is it all starts with respect. I mean, that we may have different beliefs, but we are genetically 99% identical, and I think what I would start with is looking for shared values. So often the narrative starts with what is separating us as opposed to what we have in common. And what we have in common dwarfs what actually separates us. So sort of breaking away from, and I think one of the things we do in a lot of our bridging work starts with the principle that nobody has to give up who they are to come together. So what I would say to my secular friends is, we have a strong anti-proselytizing policy. And that's such a misunderstood word. People confuse evangelical with proselytizing. The idea that we would coerce someone to convert in order to get a home is actually anathema to our values and faith.
Yes.
And so we would never do that. And I think it's really important to say that up front,
Yes.
that there's no hidden agenda, and that we really want to partner around, just as you said, there's a huge housing problem here. And we want to be a part of bringing what we can to seeing how we can help solve this together. And it's going to take public sector, private sector, civil society, people of faith in order to solve that. I think if I flipped it around, just as I would never ask my secular friends to pretend to have faith, and I would never ask my Muslim friends to lay their faith down, I would say to those who want to partner with the faith community, don't ask them to walk away from their faith in order to work with you, but focus on the elements of their faith where you've got common ground.
Wisdom that we need to share. These types of stories that need to be put out there so that people understand the concept, but then see the reality. And you're the reality. You're the people that are, how many, just give some more statistics in terms of the things that you do.
Yeah,
And maybe it's throwing a story that says, what we've been talking about in this little segment,
yeah.
How it works.
Well, our traditional model, maybe bring the most to this conversation, which was, we call it self-help housing, but it's really community help housing. So the core idea is we work with families that don't have enough income to be able to get a bank loan for a mortgage, which is a huge chunk of the world. And the model started in the US and then quickly went to Africa, which was, it's not a giveaway program. The family, we talk about it as a partnership. So instead of a down payment, the families would put in sweat equity, is what we call it. They'd actually help build their home and their neighbor's home. And in that process, you're building community as well as building the skills of the family. And then we would give them a loan, a no-profit loan that they could pay back over time. And we would recycle their payments in the community. So as they made a loan payment, that enables another family to be able to obtain a loan. And so in a way, that community aspect of that has created a very fertile ground for bridging across all kinds of difference. And I'll just give a few examples. Habitat built the first mixed-race community in South Africa after apartheid. And our patron there, Desmond Tutu, was the front of that effort, one of my great heroes. And now this is not what I would call multi-faith, but I was in Ireland, in Northern Ireland last year for the 40th anniversary of our work in both countries. I was reminded it coincided with the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Accords. And the day before they signed the Accords to end the Civil War, Tony Blair and his team spent a day building a Habitat home with Jerry Adams and the Sinn Féin team. And all of the homes in Belfast were built by Protestants and Catholics building together. Now, I don't see that as interfaith. I see that, but as we joke sometimes, getting the Catholics, Baptists, and Methodists to build together is a barrier too. And but I think one last one, we had a huge response after the devastating Indian Ocean tsunami. And if you remember, before the tsunami, Aceh had been in a civil war, and actually Christians were not allowed on the island. And this was really a heroic team. After the tsunami, the team from both our area office and Habitat Indonesia, which was about half Muslim, half Christian, went in at great sacrificial and personal risk to work with both the relief effort and then the recovery effort. And I remember when I visited, it was about 6 months later, so the first homes were going up and families were rebuilding. Every family I met had lost family members. And I'll never forget the quote from one of the women who was just about to move into her rebuilt home. And she said, of the Christians who had been part of the community, they're not my faith, and I'm of a different religion, but I'm so grateful they were here. They made our community stronger. And I think ultimately, for me, comes from a Christian faith, but I think an observant person of other faiths as well. That's ultimately sort of finally the acid test of our faith becoming real, is that it bears fruit out in the world, and that people would see that. And President Carter, another of my heroes, would consistently say that, who was evangelical Christian, said over and over again that Habitat for Humanity was the best way he knew to put his faith into action in a practical way, because in our increasingly economically segregated society, it not only allowed him to serve, but also build bridges across economic lines, which sometimes are the hardest line to cross in our society.
Those amazing stories, and I'm just thrilled we get the opportunity to hear them and to share them. And then there's a few more questions, but one thing I just wanted to ask you about in terms of your development as an organization. You're also moving into building communities from a spatial design perspective as well. And I wondered if you just wanted to speak a little about that piece of it. It connects to the faith piece and the communities, because again, communities are diverse, but you're building places now, which is a big deal in my mind. You just want to talk about the place building, please?
Yeah, no, thank you, Chris, and so relevant to this whole reason we're all here this week, which is what we know is the best model for community is mixed income, mixed use, where people can live and with people across socioeconomic lines, but also live close to where they work, with access to schools, and yet increasingly we're dividing our cities, and we're self-segregating economically and in other ways. And I think it's so as Habitat, our ideal is, can we contribute to creating places where everyone can grow and prosper together? And so I'll give actually this is a Global North example, but we did a big build in honor of President Carter, who finally, as he turned 100, stopped building when he was 95.
And is voting today.
And he did vote, which was his goal. And this was just a month ago in St. Paul, Minnesota. And it was a great example. Habitat was still doing the traditional habitat building, but in the context of a large-scale development. So this was going to be 1,200 homes, mixed income, mixed use, with 147 Habitat homes. Local utilities moving its headquarters in, creating 1,000 new jobs, There's going to be some affordable senior housing, and then market rate rental and market rate home ownership, all built together in a community that once had thrived, but hadn't done as well in the last 20 years. So it was going to be positive urban renewal, and this was going to be an all-electric community where it's going to be, for our families, incredibly low utility costs because we brought all our corporate partners in to bring advanced energy efficiency equipment. So really nice kind of holistic picture of what a healthy community could be.
Love that. I love that. That's the way we got to go. Developing places with all the pieces that have been separated out, but now we need to put them back together so we can live lives together that are ways to thrive. I mean, another example of this, I'll just share, is the Cathedral District in Jacksonville, Florida. So it's basically a geographical area, 5 historic churches are collaborating together. And it becomes a faith-based investment district where they have a plan, but they know they want to do commercial development, they need to do arts, they need to do education. So now the university is coming into the zone. But there's these churches and communities of faith that can anchor an investment. And then the housing piece. But they hired a great planning firm, Torrey Dallas, to put it all together. But now they're building reviving a whole community.
I love that.
And I think that's the future of the way to go. But the thing about that is there's people of faith and communities of faith in those locations contributing to what's happening. Makes sense, right?
No, I think it's fantastic. And I think that idea in a way of the heart of the local church should be outward facing.
Yes.
I think the last thing we want are the sort of the holy huddle where we're only looking in. Now we need to equip people, but the evidence of transformed hearts ought to be transformed lives and transformed communities. And so I love that picture of faith communities making long-term commitments to their community and really thinking strategically about the holistic welfare of the community. And it's I've seen some powerful examples. Another one, I'm a native of North Carolina, so I've always loved this one, but very similar. You had a community, African-American community, that had gone downhill for decades. And when we talk to the families, and I think this is an important principle, it ought to start with the community.
Yeah.
And what we heard from the community was, what we want is a place that young families will move into instead of escaping as soon as they could. And second, do something about the crime. It had become a high crime neighborhood. And Habitat played a catalytic role, but only a small piece of a much bigger project. And Habitat made a commitment to tear down originally just in a 4-block area, 16 of the most blighted houses and replace them with new energy efficient housing. The faith community adopted the neighborhood. Based on those commitments, some private developers bought up some other dilapidated houses and started rehabilitating it. There was a new charter elementary school, so now there was going to be a new magnet for young families to come in, and the city committed extra police presence. When I visited 2 years into the project, crime was already down 70%, and the visual transformation was hard to, and now Habitat's gone from 4 blocks to 16 blocks. They built 165 houses in the community. They actually moved their offices and their restore. We have these housing recycling stores into the community. They opened up the financial counseling and their tool library and their training to everyone in the community, not just the Habitat families. And you start seeing kind of on multiple dimensions, transformations start to take place. And that's ultimately what we all are about.
Exactly. Last question. People of faith are out there. You're doing stuff. People wanted to connect with you. How can they do that? What are the challenges that you're facing that maybe they can say, hey, I could be a part of the solution, collaborating with you in particular types of ways, as you're thinking through and breaking through, because there's a lot of challenges out there still.
Yeah.
Capital challenges, technical challenges, all these types of challenges. But the faith community, another thing I'll say, the church gathered, right? We know what the church gathered is. It can do stuff together, but when the people work out of the church doors or the mosque doors, that's when the church is scattered. And there's a lot of folks that have motivated, got the intel inside, that want to do stuff because they're technical experts at good things, and they need to be part of the solutions that can be developed. What do you kind of need some help with that people out there might say, hey, I got something to have a conversation with about that can help get over some of these challenges, some of these humps that we're facing?
Well, I think maybe to bring good out of bad, housing is finally on the agenda. I've always been amazed how rarely you hear about housing now even at the World Urban Forum, housing wouldn't have necessarily been up at the front. I remember a number of years back, in the final kind of communique out of the World Urban Forum, they didn't even mention the word housing, and we fought very hard to change that, which seems inconceivable when you think about it. I would say Anna Claudia Rusbach, the new UN Habitat Executive Director, has made housing really the center, which I think is fantastic. But we have a crisis. In the global north, cost of housing relative to what families can afford is the worst it's ever been, the gap between. And in the global south, it was already terrible, and COVID, the pandemic, and all the economic implications have made it far worse. So I would say we need everything. So we need, certainly it's easy to go to philanthropy, but it's actually more than that. We need people's voices. We actually need people of goodwill and faith. One of the saddest things to me is to see a faith community saying "not in my backyard" to their neighbors, and which can be really devastating. And one of my favorite examples from one of my favorite humans, Tony Campolo, used to be on our board long ago. And if you don't know Tony, you love him as soon as you meet him. But Tony tells a story. I'll maybe end with this because this is what we need from folks. Little town, Norwich, Pennsylvania, outside Philly. They wanted to build a home for disabled adults, sort of a halfway home to support them. And the community did not want this in their community. And it's a big meeting, media's all there, lots of the community come together. And I suspect many of those were people of faith in the room. And motion to reject it unanimously passes. Then this is dramatic. This doesn't happen every day. Doors open right after the vote, and Mother Teresa walks in. And it's the Mother Teresa.
Really?
And she's in Pennsylvania. She's in Philly for a Sisters of Mercy meeting, and someone told her about this story.
Here we go.
She goes, "I've got to go." And so she shows up. She walks down the aisle, kneels down in front of the town council, and says, "In the name of Jesus, I beg you, do not treat your sisters and brothers this way." Pause. Cameras rolling. Journalists are all watching what's going to happen. Long pause. One hand goes up. "I move we reconsider the motion." New vote. Unanimous pass. Now the problem is we can't bring Mother Teresa to all of our town council meetings, but the point is she had moral authority, and what we need are people of goodwill and faith to remember that when Jesus said love our neighbor, he had a really wide definition of who our neighbor is.
That's a great story to end it on. Thank you, Jonathan.
It's great to be with you, Chris.
Yeah. By the way, I'm in the United States because of Tony.